The question of whether we possess free will or whether everything is predetermined has been a central theme in philosophy, science, and religion for centuries. The nature of human agency, the extent of our choices, and the influence of external forces have been debated by thinkers from various traditions, each offering unique perspectives on this fundamental aspect of existence. The tension between determinism and free will raises profound implications for morality, responsibility, and the very nature of consciousness. Understanding this debate requires delving into multiple philosophical traditions, scientific discoveries, and existential reflections that attempt to reconcile human experience with the nature of reality. Determinism, in its most general form, asserts that every event or action is the inevitable consequence of preceding events and natural laws. If determinism is true, then human choices are not truly autonomous but are instead the result of causal chains extending infinitely into the past. The laws of physics, genetics, environment, and past experiences shape every decision a person makes, leaving no room for an uncaused act of will. The classical mechanistic view of the universe, as espoused by thinkers such as Isaac Newton and Pierre-Simon Laplace, suggests that if one had complete knowledge of the state of the universe at any given moment, they could predict every future event with absolute certainty. In this view, free will is an illusion. Our feeling of choice is merely a byproduct of complex but ultimately deterministic processes. One of the earliest philosophical arguments for determinism comes from the ancient Stoics, who believed in a rationally ordered cosmos governed by divine reason, or logos. The Stoics argued that everything occurs according to necessity and that human freedom lies not in altering events but in accepting the fate that unfolds. The idea that the universe follows an inescapable logic was echoed in Eastern traditions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, which propose the doctrine of karma. This principle maintains that all actions have inevitable consequences, binding individuals to cycles of cause and effect across lifetimes, thereby shaping their destinies. While these traditions do not entirely deny agency, they place human will within a framework of causality that is beyond complete control. The theological debate on free will versus predestination has also played a significant role in shaping this discourse. In Christianity, figures such as Augustine and John Calvin advanced doctrines of divine foreknowledge and predestination. If an omniscient deity knows every future action, then the course of human life is already determined, leaving little room for genuine choice. This view creates a paradox. If God is all-knowing and infallible, then whatever he foresees must necessarily come to pass, thereby negating the possibility of free will. Conversely, other theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas, sought to reconcile divine omniscience with human freedom by arguing that God's knowledge does not cause human choices but rather encompasses them outside of time. Despite the historical dominance of deterministic perspectives, many philosophers have defended the notion of free will. Existentialist thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre argue that human beings are condemned to be free. Sartre rejects the idea that our choices are dictated by external forces, emphasizing radical autonomy and responsibility. He asserts that even in the face of external constraints, individuals must choose how they respond, thereby defining their essence through action. For existentialists, the burden of freedom is both liberating and anxiety-inducing, as it places full responsibility on the individual without recourse to fate or divine plans. Compatibilists attempt to reconcile determinism with free will by suggesting that freedom does not require the absence of causation but rather the ability to act in accordance with one's own desires and rational deliberations. Thinkers like David Hume and John Stuart Mill maintain that as long as individuals can act without external coercion, they possess meaningful agency. This perspective distinguishes between constraints imposed by external forces and those stemming from internal motivations, arguing that genuine choice exists within deterministic frameworks. Modern science further complicates the debate. Neuroscience has shown that much of human behavior is influenced by unconscious processes, challenging the traditional notion of a freely choosing self. Studies by neuroscientists like Benjamin Libet suggest that decisions may be initiated in the brain before they enter conscious awareness, implying that what we experience as free will might be an illusion generated after the fact. Additionally, genetics and environmental factors play significant roles in shaping personality, decision-making, and even moral inclinations, leading some to argue that human actions are largely predetermined by biological and external conditions. Quantum mechanics, however, introduces an element of indeterminacy into the equation. Unlike classical physics, which upholds strict causality, quantum theory suggests that events at the subatomic level occur probabilistically rather than deterministically. Some philosophers and physicists have speculated that this quantum indeterminacy could provide a basis for free will, as it introduces unpredictability into the fabric of reality. However, others argue that randomness is not the same as true agency. Merely being unpredictable does not equate to having genuine control over one's actions. The debate over free will and determinism also intersects with ethical and legal considerations. If all actions are predetermined, then the foundations of moral responsibility are called into question. Can individuals be justly punished or rewarded for actions that were inevitable? Many legal and moral systems operate under the assumption that individuals possess the ability to choose between right and wrong. Without free will, notions of justice, accountability, and retribution would require fundamental reassessment. Some philosophers advocate for a pragmatic approach, suggesting that even if free will is an illusion, it remains a necessary one for the functioning of society. In personal experience, the feeling of free will is difficult to deny. We perceive ourselves as making choices, deliberating over options, and directing our own paths. Even if this perception is ultimately illusory, it remains a powerful and defining aspect of human consciousness. The illusion of free will, if it is indeed an illusion, shapes identity, creativity, ambition, and relationships. Without it, the human experience might seem impoverished, lacking the depth and complexity that make life meaningful. Ultimately, the question of free will versus determinism remains unresolved, as both perspectives offer compelling arguments. The deterministic view provides a coherent explanation of causality and order in the universe, while the belief in free will preserves the essence of human autonomy and moral agency. Perhaps the most practical stance is one of compatibilism, acknowledging the constraints imposed by nature and nurture while maintaining that individuals possess meaningful degrees of freedom within those limits. Whether free will is real or illusory, the belief in our own agency continues to shape the way we live, love, and seek purpose in an intricate and mysterious world. The debate over free will and determinism extends beyond philosophy and science into the realm of personal experience and subjective perception. Every individual navigates life under the assumption that choices are real, that decisions matter, and that agency is an essential component of human existence. This belief is deeply ingrained in human psychology, and even those who argue for determinism continue to act as though they possess autonomy in their daily lives. This paradox illustrates the difficulty of fully embracing determinism in a practical sense, as it contradicts the immediate and intuitive experience of decision-making. Even when confronted with evidence suggesting that choices arise from unconscious processes or predetermined influences, people still feel as though they are the authors of their actions, which makes the debate not just intellectual but deeply existential. The persistence of this feeling raises the question of whether free will, even if illusory, serves an essential psychological or evolutionary function. One perspective on this issue is that belief in free will promotes agency and responsibility. Psychological studies suggest that individuals who believe in their own capacity to make choices are more motivated, goal-oriented, and ethical in their behavior. When people view themselves as autonomous agents, they are more likely to strive for self-improvement, take accountability for their actions, and work toward their aspirations. Conversely, when individuals are convinced that their actions are entirely dictated by forces beyond their control, they may succumb to passivity, resignation, or moral nihilism. This phenomenon, known as fatalistic determinism, can lead to a loss of personal agency, where individuals feel powerless to change their circumstances and disengage from meaningful efforts toward self-betterment or societal progress. In this sense, belief in free will, whether true or not, may serve as a necessary illusion that enhances human flourishing and motivation. However, those who argue for determinism counter that acknowledging the absence of free will does not necessarily lead to apathy or moral collapse. Instead, they suggest that understanding human behavior as a product of causality allows for greater empathy and social reform. If actions are dictated by genetic predispositions, environmental conditioning, and neurological processes, then blame and punishment become less justifiable as responses to wrongdoing. Instead of viewing individuals as morally culpable in the traditional sense, determinists advocate for systems of justice and rehabilitation that address the underlying causes of behavior rather than focusing solely on punitive measures. From this perspective, recognizing the deterministic nature of human action can foster a more compassionate and effective approach to law, mental health, and social policy, shifting the focus from retribution to prevention and rehabilitation. This tension between moral responsibility and determinism has led to various attempts to reconcile the two. One such approach is soft determinism or compatibilism, which posits that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. According to this view, freedom does not require absolute independence from causality but rather the ability to act in accordance with one's own desires, reasoning, and personality. Compatibilists argue that as long as individuals are not coerced by external forces, their actions can still be considered free, even if those actions are ultimately determined by prior causes. This perspective allows for moral responsibility to be preserved within a deterministic framework, offering a middle ground between the extremes of strict determinism and libertarian free will. Critics of compatibilism, however, argue that this definition of free will is a semantic compromise rather than a genuine resolution of the issue. If one's desires and reasoning are themselves determined by prior causes, then the ability to act upon them does not constitute true freedom in the metaphysical sense. Even if an individual feels they are acting freely, the underlying factors that shaped their decision were beyond their control, making the notion of true autonomy questionable. From this standpoint, compatibilism may be more of a psychological coping mechanism than a fully coherent philosophical position, as it seeks to preserve the illusion of agency without fundamentally addressing the deterministic nature of reality. Some thinkers propose that the key to understanding free will lies in re-examining the nature of consciousness itself. Traditional dualistic perspectives, which separate mind and matter, often assert that the human soul or spirit exists outside the realm of deterministic physical laws. This view, which has roots in religious and metaphysical traditions, suggests that free will operates in a domain beyond material causation. However, dualism faces significant challenges from modern neuroscience and physics, both of which suggest that mental states are closely tied to physical processes in the brain. If consciousness arises from neural activity, and if neural activity is subject to physical laws, then it becomes difficult to explain how free will could emerge in a non-determined manner. Nevertheless, some philosophers and scientists argue that our current understanding of consciousness is incomplete and that new insights into the nature of the mind could eventually provide a resolution to the free will debate. One such speculative perspective involves panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality rather than an emergent property of complex systems. If consciousness is intrinsic to the fabric of the universe, it is possible that free will could arise in ways that are not yet fully understood. Similarly, theories that integrate quantum mechanics and consciousness suggest that indeterminacy at the quantum level could play a role in decision-making processes, introducing an element of unpredictability that might allow for genuine choice. However, these ideas remain highly controversial and speculative, with no clear empirical evidence to support the claim that quantum indeterminacy translates into meaningful human agency. The implications of this debate extend beyond philosophy and science into the practical realms of law, politics, and ethics. The criminal justice system, for example, is largely predicated on the assumption that individuals have the capacity to make choices and should be held accountable for their actions. If determinism is true, then the concept of punishment as retribution becomes questionable, and a shift toward rehabilitation and preventative measures becomes more justifiable. Similarly, political ideologies that emphasize personal responsibility and meritocracy may need to be reconsidered in light of the deterministic influences of genetics, socioeconomic background, and environmental factors. A deterministic worldview suggests that success and failure are not purely the result of individual effort but are significantly shaped by circumstances beyond one's control, which has implications for policies regarding education, economic inequality, and social mobility. Despite the complexity of this debate, the lived experience of human beings continues to be one of choice and agency. Even those who intellectually embrace determinism must navigate life as though their choices matter, making plans, setting goals, and struggling with moral dilemmas. This experiential contradiction suggests that regardless of the ultimate truth of the matter, belief in free will is deeply embedded in the human condition. Whether this belief reflects a fundamental reality or a necessary cognitive illusion remains an open question, but its significance in shaping human culture, ethics, and personal identity is undeniable. Ultimately, the question of free will versus determinism may never be definitively resolved, as it touches on the deepest mysteries of existence, consciousness, and causality. Perhaps the best approach is one of philosophical humility, recognizing the limits of our understanding while continuing to explore the implications of both perspectives. Whether we are truly free agents or merely complex biological machines following deterministic laws, the pursuit of knowledge, meaning, and ethical living remains an integral part of the human experience. The act of questioning itself, the very process of engaging with this debate, is a testament to the depth and richness of human thought, regardless of whether that thought is freely willed or causally determined. The debate between free will and determinism has persisted through centuries because it touches on some of the most fundamental aspects of human existence. It challenges our understanding of personal identity, morality, justice, and even the nature of reality itself. Despite the long history of discussion, no consensus has been reached, largely because the question is so deeply intertwined with the nature of human perception and the limits of human knowledge. The belief in free will is a powerful and deeply ingrained part of our everyday experience. We feel as though we are the authors of our own actions, that our decisions are genuinely ours, and that we could have chosen otherwise. This sense of agency is foundational to our concepts of self-worth, responsibility, and autonomy. However, determinism presents a picture of the universe where everything unfolds according to laws and prior conditions, rendering the notion of true choice an illusion. The tension between these perspectives is not easily resolved, as each carries significant implications for how we live our lives and structure our societies. Many who defend determinism argue that human beings are essentially complex biological machines, governed by physical and chemical processes beyond their control. Advances in neuroscience have reinforced this view, demonstrating that much of our decision-making occurs at an unconscious level before we become aware of it. Studies like those conducted by Benjamin Libet suggest that the brain initiates actions milliseconds before we consciously decide to perform them. If our brains are making choices before we are aware of them, then the notion of conscious control over our actions is called into question. Furthermore, research in genetics and psychology indicates that personality traits, behaviors, and even moral tendencies are significantly influenced by inherited traits and environmental conditions. If who we are is shaped by factors beyond our choosing, how can we claim to be truly free? Yet, the deterministic perspective, while scientifically compelling, does not fully capture the richness of human experience. Even if our choices are influenced by prior causes, we still feel as though we are making decisions, struggling with dilemmas, and weighing options. This lived experience of decision-making is difficult to dismiss, and some argue that even if determinism is true, it does not negate the meaningfulness of human agency. Compatibilists, for instance, argue that free will and determinism can coexist if we redefine what it means to be free. Rather than requiring that our choices be entirely independent of prior causes, compatibilism suggests that as long as we act according to our desires, beliefs, and reasoning, we can be considered free in a meaningful sense. This view allows for personal responsibility and moral accountability while accepting the causal structure of the universe. Critics of compatibilism argue that this definition of free will is too weak, as it does not escape the fundamental problem of determinism. If our desires and reasoning are themselves shaped by forces beyond our control, then our choices are not truly our own. Even if we feel free, we are merely following the paths set by biology and environment. This raises troubling questions about justice and morality. If people are not truly free, can they be held accountable for their actions? Should society shift its focus away from punishment and toward rehabilitation, since criminals may not have had real control over their behavior? These questions are not just philosophical but have real-world implications for legal systems, ethics, and social structures. An alternative to determinism is the libertarian view of free will, which asserts that human beings possess genuine freedom to choose among multiple possibilities. This perspective often appeals to the idea that we are more than just biological mechanisms, that consciousness and rationality allow us to transcend deterministic forces. Some libertarians argue that our choices are not determined but rather influenced by reasons, values, and self-reflection. However, this view faces significant challenges. If human actions are not determined, what explains them? If they are not caused by anything, do they arise randomly? Randomness does not seem to provide a strong foundation for meaningful choice. Furthermore, libertarian free will must account for how conscious decision-making can override the deterministic forces of physics and biology without violating the laws of nature. Without a clear mechanism for how this is possible, many find libertarian free will difficult to defend. Another perspective, one that bridges both scientific and philosophical inquiry, comes from quantum mechanics. Unlike classical physics, which presents a deterministic view of reality, quantum mechanics introduces an element of unpredictability at the microscopic level. Some theorists have speculated that quantum indeterminacy might allow for free will by introducing randomness into neural processes. However, randomness alone does not provide meaningful freedom, it merely replaces one form of determinism with another. If our choices are the result of random quantum fluctuations, that does not grant us any more control over them than if they were strictly determined by prior causes. While quantum mechanics challenges a strictly deterministic worldview, it does not necessarily provide a clear pathway to true autonomy. Another line of thought explores the connection between free will and consciousness. Some argue that consciousness itself is an emergent property that cannot be fully explained by deterministic physical processes. Theories such as panpsychism suggest that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe rather than a byproduct of brain activity. If consciousness plays a unique role in decision-making, it might allow for a form of free will that is not strictly bound by deterministic processes. However, the nature of consciousness remains one of the greatest mysteries of modern science and philosophy, and without a clearer understanding of its mechanisms, it is difficult to draw definitive conclusions about its relationship to free will. The debate also has existential implications. If determinism is true, then our lives are part of an unchangeable script, unfolding according to laws that were set in motion long before we were born. This realization can be unsettling, as it challenges the notion that we are in control of our destinies. Some people find this perspective liberating, as it absolves them of ultimate responsibility and suggests that they are part of a grand, interconnected cosmic order. Others find it deeply troubling, as it appears to strip life of meaning and personal significance. On the other hand, if free will exists, it affirms the importance of human choice, self-determination, and moral responsibility. It suggests that we are not merely passive observers in the universe but active participants in shaping our own paths. Ultimately, the question of free will versus determinism remains unresolved because it touches on some of the deepest mysteries of existence, the nature of time, causality, consciousness, and the universe itself. Perhaps the truth lies in a synthesis of these views, where determinism governs the broad structure of reality, but within that structure, human beings possess enough flexibility and complexity to exercise meaningful choice. Whether or not we are truly free, the belief in our own agency continues to shape how we think, act, and relate to one another. Even if free will is an illusion, it is an illusion that defines the human experience. The act of engaging with this debate, questioning our own assumptions, and seeking understanding is itself a testament to the complexity and depth of the human mind. Whether we are bound by fate or forging our own path, the search for meaning and truth remains an essential part of our existence. The question of free will and determinism is one that continues to perplex philosophers, scientists, and thinkers from all walks of life. It is a debate that reaches beyond theoretical discourse and into the very essence of what it means to be human. If free will exists, it means that individuals are truly responsible for their actions, that they are capable of making choices independent of past events and physical laws. If determinism holds true, then every action, thought, and decision is the inevitable result of a preceding chain of events, governed by laws beyond our control. This contradiction has profound implications for everything from ethics to psychology, from law to personal identity. No matter how the debate unfolds, one thing is certain: our perception of reality is deeply tied to how we answer this question, and our entire system of values and beliefs hinges upon it in ways we may not even consciously realize. Many who argue for determinism rest their case on the idea that the universe operates under a strict set of natural laws. Everything from the movement of planets to the firing of neurons in the brain can be explained through causal relationships. Modern science has reinforced this view, demonstrating that human behavior is significantly influenced, if not outright determined, by genetics, environment, and biological processes. Neuroscience, for example, has shown that much of what we think of as conscious decision-making actually originates in unconscious brain activity. This challenges the notion that we are the true authors of our actions, suggesting instead that our choices are predetermined by physical states within our brains. Moreover, behavioral psychology supports this view by illustrating how early life experiences, social conditioning, and even cultural influences shape our tendencies and responses to the world. If our actions are merely the product of these influences, then free will, as traditionally conceived, becomes difficult to justify. Yet despite these findings, the experience of making choices remains deeply ingrained in human life. We deliberate over decisions, wrestle with moral dilemmas, and plan for the future as though our choices genuinely matter. If determinism is true, why does this illusion persist so strongly? Some argue that the perception of free will is an evolutionary adaptation, a necessary construct that allows us to function effectively. From an evolutionary standpoint, the belief in agency may have conferred survival advantages, encouraging social cooperation, moral responsibility, and personal ambition. Whether real or illusory, this sense of control enables individuals to take ownership of their actions, fostering a sense of accountability and drive that might not exist in a purely deterministic worldview. Compatibilism attempts to bridge the gap between these two perspectives by proposing that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. According to this view, even if our choices are ultimately determined by prior causes, they can still be considered free as long as they align with our internal motivations and desires. Under compatibilism, the key to free will is not the absence of causation but rather the presence of rational deliberation and self-reflection. If a person acts according to their own values, free from coercion or external manipulation, their choice can still be regarded as an expression of free will even if it was determined by prior influences. This perspective allows for a nuanced understanding of agency, maintaining the importance of personal responsibility while acknowledging the constraints of causality. However, critics argue that compatibilism merely redefines free will in a way that makes it compatible with determinism, without addressing the deeper issue. If our values, desires, and rational deliberations are themselves the products of deterministic forces, then our choices are not truly free in the fundamental sense. We may feel as though we are making independent decisions, but in reality, we are simply enacting a script that was written by biology, environment, and circumstance. If we did not choose the factors that shaped our desires and reasoning, can we truly claim to have control over our decisions? This challenge remains a significant hurdle for compatibilist accounts of free will. Libertarian free will, by contrast, holds that human beings possess genuine autonomy and are capable of making choices that are not entirely determined by past events. Proponents of this view argue that we can, in some meaningful sense, step outside the causal chain and act independently of deterministic forces. However, this view must contend with the problem of explaining how such autonomy is possible. If actions are not determined by prior causes, does that mean they occur randomly? And if they occur randomly, how can they be considered the result of conscious, rational deliberation? The challenge for libertarianism is to provide a coherent account of how free will can operate without either collapsing into determinism or relying on randomness. Some have attempted to resolve this by invoking the notion of agent causation, which suggests that individuals, as conscious agents, are the true originators of their actions in a way that transcends mere physical causality. However, this concept remains controversial and lacks empirical support. Another potential avenue for resolving the debate lies in our understanding of consciousness itself. Traditional materialist perspectives hold that consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity, entirely explainable in terms of physical processes. If this is true, then it seems likely that our thoughts and decisions are likewise determined by these processes. However, alternative theories suggest that consciousness may not be reducible to purely physical explanations. Some philosophers and scientists argue that consciousness plays a fundamental role in shaping reality, rather than being a mere epiphenomenon. If consciousness possesses a unique causal power that cannot be fully explained by deterministic physics, then there may be room for a form of free will that is not bound by classical causation. However, as with other speculative theories, this perspective is difficult to verify and remains largely theoretical. Even within a deterministic framework, there is still room to explore concepts of self-improvement, growth, and meaning. If our actions and choices are determined, this does not necessarily render them meaningless. Instead, determinism can be seen as a recognition that human behavior is influenced by countless interwoven factors, many of which we have some degree of influence over. While we may not be entirely free in an ultimate sense, we can still shape the conditions that influence our future selves. Education, self-reflection, and intentional action can all contribute to the development of a more refined sense of agency, even if that agency operates within a deterministic structure. Moreover, determinism does not necessarily negate moral responsibility. If we acknowledge that people act according to their conditions and influences, we can also acknowledge that social structures, education, and ethical considerations play a vital role in shaping those influences. A deterministic perspective can lead to a more compassionate and constructive approach to justice, shifting the focus from punishment to rehabilitation. If criminal behavior is the result of environmental and biological factors, then the most effective response is not punitive but corrective, addressing the root causes of behavior rather than simply punishing the outcome. In this sense, determinism can provide a framework for a more empathetic and humane society. At the same time, it is difficult to completely shake the feeling that we are active participants in our own lives. The daily experience of choice, the struggles of moral decision-making, and the pursuit of personal goals all reinforce the belief that we have control over our destinies. Whether this belief is a psychological necessity, a social construct, or an actual feature of reality remains an open question. Perhaps the very act of engaging with this debate, of questioning our assumptions, exploring different perspectives, and seeking deeper understanding, is itself a demonstration of human agency. Even if determinism holds, the pursuit of knowledge, self-awareness, and ethical action remains an essential part of the human experience. We may never fully resolve the paradox of free will and determinism, but the journey of inquiry itself is a testament to the depth and richness of human thought. The problem of free will and determinism has not only been a philosophical dilemma but also a question that shapes the way we understand ourselves, our relationships, and our societies. If our actions and decisions are determined by prior causes, does it mean that personal responsibility is an illusion? If free will exists, how does it operate within the constraints of natural laws? These questions touch on everything from moral accountability to scientific explanations of consciousness, leading to an ongoing debate that has persisted for centuries. As science and philosophy progress, new perspectives emerge, but no single answer has resolved the tension between determinism and free will. It is a paradox that continues to demand exploration, as both positions seem to contain truths that cannot be entirely dismissed. Some thinkers have argued that the belief in free will is an essential feature of human cognition, necessary for making sense of our experiences. If we did not believe in our ability to choose, our entire framework of ethics, justice, and personal responsibility would collapse. Yet, others counter that our beliefs about agency might be illusions crafted by evolution, existing to give us a sense of control even in a world where every action is inevitable. The deterministic worldview gains strength from advances in physics, neuroscience, and psychology. Classical physics describes a universe governed by immutable laws where every event is the consequence of preceding conditions. If this applies to everything in the universe, then human decisions are just another manifestation of these laws, following from brain activity that itself is subject to physical causation. Neuroscientific studies reinforce this view by demonstrating that decisions can be predicted before we are consciously aware of making them. Brain scans reveal that activity in neural circuits corresponds to choices before they enter conscious awareness, suggesting that what we experience as a decision is merely the final stage of a process that has already been determined. The implications of this are profound. If our brains decide before we do, can we truly say we have control? This is the foundation of hard determinism, which argues that all human actions are necessitated by prior events, making true free will impossible. This perspective forces us to re-evaluate our notions of justice, morality, and even personal identity. If no one can act outside of deterministic forces, does it make sense to punish people for their crimes? If a person's actions are the inevitable result of genetics, upbringing, and social conditions, then criminal behavior is as much a product of circumstance as any other natural event. Some argue that this understanding should lead to a shift in focus from punishment to rehabilitation, where the goal is not retribution but the correction of the underlying causes that lead to harmful behavior. Yet, despite these arguments, the experience of making choices remains an undeniable part of human life. Whether illusion or reality, the feeling of agency is what defines much of our existence. The way we engage with the world, take responsibility for our actions, and strive for self-improvement all suggest that we operate under the assumption that our choices matter. This is why compatibilism has emerged as an influential perspective, offering a middle ground between free will and determinism. Compatibilists argue that even if our decisions are shaped by prior causes, we are still free if we act according to our desires and reasoning. In this view, freedom does not require the absence of causation but the presence of rational self-determination. This allows for moral responsibility to remain intact while acknowledging that every action is part of a larger causal chain. While compatibilism is appealing in that it preserves both scientific determinism and practical notions of responsibility, critics argue that it does not fully resolve the problem. If our desires and reasoning are themselves shaped by forces beyond our control, are we truly free? If we were born with different genes or raised in different circumstances, would we make different choices? If so, how can we claim ownership over our decisions? Libertarianism, on the other hand, rejects determinism altogether and argues that free will exists in a more fundamental sense. According to this view, human beings possess the ability to make genuinely undetermined choices. Some libertarians argue that our consciousness allows us to break free from the strict causality that governs the physical world. However, this position faces the challenge of explaining how such freedom is possible. If our actions are not determined, then what causes them? If they arise from pure randomness, does that make them any more meaningful? Many critics argue that undetermined actions are not truly free but simply chaotic. To address this, some libertarians propose the idea of agent causation, where individuals themselves are the originating causes of their actions, independent of external influences. However, this idea raises further questions about how agents operate outside the normal laws of causality without invoking supernatural explanations. One possible way to reconcile these issues is by looking at developments in physics, particularly in the realm of quantum mechanics. Unlike classical physics, which operates on deterministic principles, quantum mechanics introduces an element of probability and uncertainty. Some theorists suggest that if the brain operates at a quantum level, then decision-making might involve non-deterministic processes, allowing for genuine free will. However, this idea is speculative, and most scientists caution against drawing conclusions too quickly. Even if quantum indeterminacy plays a role in brain function, it is not clear that this randomness translates into meaningful choice. If our actions are based on quantum fluctuations, they may be unpredictable, but that does not necessarily mean they are freely chosen. This makes the quantum argument for free will intriguing but far from conclusive. A different approach to understanding free will is through the study of consciousness itself. Some philosophers and scientists argue that consciousness is more than just a product of brain activity and that it plays an active role in shaping reality. If consciousness has causal power that is not reducible to deterministic processes, then it might allow for a form of free will that is neither fully determined nor random. However, the nature of consciousness remains one of the greatest mysteries in both philosophy and science. Some theories, such as panpsychism, suggest that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe rather than a mere byproduct of brain processes. If this is true, then free will may be rooted in something deeper than physical causation. However, without a clear mechanism to explain how consciousness interacts with the physical world, this idea remains largely speculative. Beyond the scientific and philosophical dimensions, the debate over free will has profound existential implications. If determinism is true, does that mean our lives are meaningless? Some argue that a deterministic universe strips existence of purpose, reducing human beings to mere cogs in a vast causal machine. Others, however, contend that meaning does not depend on free will but on our subjective experience of life. Even if our choices are determined, we still experience love, joy, struggle, and achievement in ways that matter to us. From this perspective, meaning is not diminished by determinism but rather shaped by the narratives we construct about our lives. On the other hand, if free will exists, it affirms the idea that individuals have genuine control over their destinies. This perspective supports ideas of self-determination, moral responsibility, and personal growth. If we are truly free, then our choices define who we are, making life an ongoing process of self-creation. However, this also comes with a burden. If we are genuinely free, then we must accept full responsibility for our actions, without blaming fate, biology, or external circumstances. This can be an empowering but also overwhelming realization. Ultimately, the question of free will versus determinism may never be fully resolved, as it touches on some of the deepest mysteries of existence. Perhaps reality is more complex than either pure determinism or absolute free will can capture. It may be that human agency operates within a structured but flexible framework, where deterministic forces set broad parameters, but within those parameters, individuals exercise meaningful choice. Whether or not free will is an illusion, the belief in our own agency continues to shape how we think, act, and engage with the world. Even if we are bound by causality, the search for truth, meaning, and understanding remains a fundamental part of the human condition. And perhaps, in the end, the act of questioning itself is the greatest expression of free will. The question of free will versus determinism is not merely an abstract debate but one that has profound implications for how we view ourselves, our actions, and the very structure of society. If determinism holds true, then everything we think, feel, and do is simply the inevitable consequence of a long chain of prior causes, stretching back to the very beginning of the universe. This would mean that the concept of personal responsibility is, at its core, an illusion, as no one could have truly acted differently from how they did. On the other hand, if free will exists, it grants humanity a unique form of agency that is unlike anything else in nature, a capacity for genuine choice and self-determination that sets us apart. The difficulty lies in reconciling our lived experience of making choices with the possibility that all of our actions are already determined by forces outside of our control. Even those who accept a deterministic framework often struggle to fully embrace its implications, as the human mind seems wired to perceive itself as an autonomous agent, capable of independent thought and action. Scientific advancements have increasingly supported the deterministic perspective, especially in fields like neuroscience, psychology, and genetics. Studies have shown that decisions often originate in the brain before we become consciously aware of them, suggesting that what we experience as a choice is simply the brain processing an inevitable outcome. Furthermore, psychological research has demonstrated the powerful effects of upbringing, environment, and social conditioning on behavior, making it difficult to argue that people act independently of these influences. Genetic research has further reinforced this idea by revealing how deeply our biology shapes our tendencies, preferences, and even personality traits. If our actions are determined by a combination of genetic predispositions and environmental conditioning, then the idea of free will begins to appear more like a convenient illusion than a genuine phenomenon. Yet, despite this, the human experience is one of deliberation, struggle, and decision-making. We feel as though we weigh options, consider consequences, and ultimately arrive at our own conclusions. The disconnect between this lived experience and the deterministic model presents one of the greatest challenges in this debate. If we are not truly free, then why do we feel as though we are? Some philosophers and scientists argue that the belief in free will is an evolutionary adaptation that serves an important function. Even if free will does not exist in a metaphysical sense, the perception of agency is crucial for motivation, responsibility, and social cohesion. If people truly believed that all of their actions were predetermined, it could lead to fatalism, where individuals no longer see the point in striving for improvement or taking responsibility for their choices. Society functions on the assumption that people are accountable for their actions, and abandoning this notion entirely could have serious consequences for morality, justice, and human relationships. This pragmatic argument suggests that even if free will is not real, it is still necessary for maintaining a functional and meaningful society. However, critics argue that determinism does not necessarily lead to fatalism. Even if our actions are determined, that does not mean they are meaningless. Understanding the factors that shape behavior could lead to a more compassionate and effective approach to justice, one that focuses on addressing the root causes of actions rather than simply punishing individuals for choices they had no control over. If criminal behavior is the result of biological and environmental influences, then the logical response is not retribution but rehabilitation. Instead of blaming individuals, society could work to change the conditions that lead to harmful actions in the first place. Compatibilism offers a middle ground between free will and determinism, arguing that even if our actions are determined, we can still be considered free as long as we act according to our desires and reasoning. This view preserves the idea of moral responsibility while acknowledging the role of causality. According to compatibilists, freedom does not require an absence of causation but rather the ability to act in alignment with one's own motivations without coercion. However, this perspective is not without its critics. If our desires and motivations are themselves determined by prior causes, can we truly be said to be free? If we did not choose the factors that shaped our personalities, values, and decision-making processes, then in what sense do we actually exercise autonomy? Some argue that compatibilism simply redefines free will in a way that makes it compatible with determinism without truly resolving the fundamental issue. Despite these concerns, compatibilism remains an attractive option for those who want to reconcile scientific determinism with the human experience of choice and responsibility. Libertarian free will, which asserts that individuals have the capacity to make genuinely undetermined choices, remains a minority view in academic philosophy but still holds intuitive appeal for many. The idea that we are the true authors of our actions resonates with our sense of self and moral responsibility. However, libertarianism faces significant philosophical and scientific challenges. If our choices are not determined by prior causes, then what explains them? If they are truly random, then how can they be considered meaningful? Some libertarians attempt to address this by proposing that human agents themselves are the originators of their actions in a way that transcends causal determinism. This idea, known as agent causation, suggests that individuals are not bound by the same deterministic rules as physical processes. However, this concept remains difficult to define and lacks empirical support, making it a controversial position within the free will debate. Another potential avenue for reconciling free will with scientific understanding is found in quantum mechanics. Unlike classical physics, which operates under strict deterministic laws, quantum mechanics introduces an element of probability and uncertainty. Some theorists have suggested that if the brain operates at a quantum level, then decision-making might involve non-deterministic processes, allowing for genuine free will. However, this hypothesis remains speculative, and most scientists argue that quantum indeterminacy does not necessarily translate into meaningful choice. Even if quantum randomness plays a role in neural activity, this would not provide the kind of intentional agency required for free will. If our actions are based on random quantum fluctuations, they may be unpredictable, but that does not mean they are freely chosen. Nonetheless, the intersection between quantum mechanics and consciousness remains an open area of inquiry, and future discoveries may shed new light on this issue. The debate over free will also has significant implications for ethics and the law. If determinism is true, then traditional notions of justice based on blame and punishment may need to be reconsidered. Instead of viewing individuals as morally culpable in the traditional sense, society might adopt a more rehabilitative approach, focusing on understanding and mitigating the factors that lead to harmful behavior. This shift would not mean abandoning accountability but rather redefining it in a way that aligns with a deterministic understanding of human nature. On the other hand, if free will exists, then individuals must take full responsibility for their actions, accepting both the rewards and consequences of their choices. This perspective reinforces the idea of personal agency and moral responsibility but also comes with the challenge of explaining how free will operates within a world governed by causal laws. At a deeper existential level, the question of free will shapes our understanding of meaning and purpose. If determinism holds, does that mean our lives are devoid of meaning? Some argue that meaning does not require free will but is instead derived from our experiences, relationships, and contributions to the world. Even if our actions are determined, we still engage in love, creativity, and personal growth in ways that feel meaningful. From this perspective, the pursuit of knowledge, self-improvement, and ethical living remains valuable, regardless of whether our choices are ultimately free. Others, however, believe that true meaning requires genuine agency, as a predetermined life would lack the element of authentic self-determination. The existential weight of this debate is one reason why it continues to captivate thinkers across disciplines. Ultimately, the question of free will versus determinism may never be fully resolved. Both perspectives contain compelling arguments, and each has implications that challenge our understanding of reality. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in a framework that acknowledges both the constraints of causality and the subjective experience of agency. Whether or not free will is an illusion, the pursuit of understanding remains a defining characteristic of human nature. And perhaps, in the very act of questioning and seeking answers, we exercise the deepest form of agency we possess. The exploration of free will versus determinism leads to an even deeper discussion about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the way in which we conceptualize human existence. The core of the debate revolves around whether human beings are active agents capable of shaping their own destinies or whether they are simply complex biological machines, responding to the laws of physics and the causality of the universe. If everything we do is predetermined by prior causes, then the very notion of individual identity, moral responsibility, and personal growth must be reassessed. However, if free will is genuine, it raises the question of how it can exist in a universe governed by physical laws that apply to all other entities and processes. The challenge is in finding a framework that either reconciles these two views or decisively proves one over the other. But as history has shown, every time one side seems to gain ground, new discoveries and perspectives emerge that reignite the debate. One of the most compelling aspects of this discussion is how it touches upon virtually every aspect of human life, from our legal systems and social structures to our personal relationships and sense of purpose. One of the strongest arguments in favor of determinism comes from neuroscience, which increasingly shows that human decisions are the result of neural processes occurring before we are consciously aware of them. Studies using brain imaging techniques, such as fMRI and EEG, have demonstrated that patterns of brain activity can predict choices seconds before a person consciously makes a decision. This suggests that what we perceive as conscious decision-making is merely the final stage of a process that has already been determined by neural activity. If our brains are making decisions before we are even aware of them, then where is the space for free will? The idea that consciousness merely serves as a spectator, observing and rationalizing decisions already made at the subconscious level, is unsettling because it contradicts our deep-seated belief in agency. If everything is the inevitable outcome of brain chemistry and past influences, then all human actions, whether acts of kindness or acts of violence, are simply the unfolding of prior causes. The implications of this viewpoint challenge the foundation of ethical and legal systems, as they are built upon the assumption that individuals have the ability to choose their actions and therefore bear responsibility for them. Yet despite the compelling evidence for determinism, the lived experience of making choices remains powerful. Every day, we deliberate between different options, weighing consequences and struggling with moral dilemmas. If our choices were truly predetermined, would we not feel more like passive observers of our lives rather than active participants? The fact that we experience hesitation, conflict, and reflection suggests that something beyond simple cause and effect is at play. This is where arguments for compatibilism gain traction, offering a nuanced perspective that acknowledges the deterministic nature of reality while preserving the meaningfulness of choice. Compatibilists argue that freedom does not require the absence of causation but rather the ability to act in accordance with one's own motivations and reasoning. According to this view, an individual is free as long as they are not coerced or externally controlled, even if their decisions arise from a deterministic framework. This allows for the preservation of personal responsibility while accepting the findings of science regarding causality and brain function. However, critics argue that compatibilism does not truly resolve the core issue, as it merely redefines free will in a way that makes it consistent with determinism without addressing the fundamental concern of whether individuals can genuinely act otherwise than they do. Libertarianism, which argues for a more robust conception of free will, maintains that humans possess the ability to make undetermined choices. Unlike compatibilists, libertarians reject the idea that freedom is compatible with determinism and instead assert that genuine agency requires that individuals are not fully bound by prior causes. However, this position faces significant challenges. If human choices are not determined by preceding events, then what explains them? If they arise from randomness, then how can they be meaningful? The problem libertarians face is in articulating a model of free will that avoids both determinism and randomness while still providing a coherent account of how choices are made. Some have turned to the concept of agent causation, which suggests that human beings, as conscious agents, are the originators of their own actions. This idea posits that while most events in the universe are governed by external causes, human agents possess a special kind of causality that allows them to initiate new chains of events independent of deterministic influences. However, agent causation remains a highly controversial theory, as it appears to lack empirical support and raises questions about how it interacts with the physical world. Quantum mechanics has been proposed as a possible avenue for understanding free will, as it introduces an element of indeterminacy into the physical world. Unlike classical physics, which operates under strict deterministic laws, quantum mechanics suggests that at a fundamental level, certain events occur probabilistically rather than inevitably. Some theorists have speculated that if the brain operates at a quantum level, then human decision-making might involve elements of true randomness, thus allowing for a kind of free will that is not bound by strict determinism. However, there are several problems with this approach. First, quantum randomness does not necessarily equate to meaningful choice. If decisions are influenced by quantum fluctuations, they may be unpredictable, but unpredictability alone does not constitute free will. Additionally, most neuroscientists argue that while quantum effects may play a role in brain function, they do not appear to be the driving force behind cognition or decision-making. Thus, while quantum mechanics presents an interesting challenge to strict determinism, it does not necessarily provide a satisfying explanation for free will. Beyond science and philosophy, the question of free will has significant implications for how we structure society. Legal systems are built on the premise that individuals have the ability to choose between right and wrong and are therefore accountable for their actions. If determinism is true, then criminal behavior is not the result of deliberate wrongdoing but rather the inevitable consequence of genetic predisposition, environmental influences, and social conditions. This would suggest that punishment as a form of retribution is misguided, and that society should instead focus on rehabilitation and addressing the root causes of crime. However, even within a deterministic framework, many argue that consequences still serve an important function. While an individual may not be morally responsible in the traditional sense, the application of consequences can still shape behavior and deter harmful actions. This approach aligns with the idea that while we may not have ultimate free will, we can still influence outcomes through structured incentives and interventions. On the other hand, if free will exists in a libertarian sense, then individuals must bear full responsibility for their choices, and justice systems are justified in holding people accountable based on their autonomous decisions. The existential implications of this debate are also profound. If determinism is true, does that mean our lives lack meaning? Some argue that without true agency, existence becomes a kind of scripted play in which we merely act out roles assigned by nature and circumstance. However, others contend that meaning does not require free will but rather arises from the experiences we have and the connections we form. Even if our actions are determined, they still shape our lives in meaningful ways. The pursuit of knowledge, love, and personal growth remains valuable, even in a deterministic world. On the other hand, if free will is real, then human beings possess the capacity to define their own purpose and shape their destinies in a profound way. This view supports the idea that life is an ongoing act of self-creation, where each choice contributes to the person we become. However, it also carries the burden of responsibility, as true freedom means accepting full ownership of one's actions and their consequences. Ultimately, the debate between free will and determinism is unlikely to be resolved definitively, as it touches upon some of the deepest mysteries of human existence. Whether we are truly free or simply complex biological entities following deterministic laws, the search for understanding remains a defining characteristic of our nature. Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between these two positions but in developing a more nuanced perspective that acknowledges both the constraints of causality and the subjective experience of agency. Whether an illusion or a reality, the belief in free will continues to shape our thoughts, behaviors, and aspirations. And perhaps, in the very act of engaging in this debate, we demonstrate the very essence of human agency. Whether real or not, it remains one of the most powerful forces in shaping the way we live and understand the world.